Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching TopTenzNet, and in the video today, the top 10 crazy conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. Conspiracy theories will always fire up the imaginations of even the most reasonable of us. It's fascinating to imagine a bunch of people in a dark room controlling actions from their chairs and encouraging events that change the course of the world, with no one truly being the wiser. Now, most conspiracy theories are absolutely flimsy nonsense that are obviously full of holes and not true at all. However, some conspiracy theories have more truth than most people would imagine. In some situations, there really was a group of people in a dark room conspiring to massively pull the wool over the eyes of others in order to change the course of the world. Number 10. The US government once planned a false flag operation against their own people. When most people hear about 9/11 conspiracy theories, they have very similar reactions. Most people believe that the amount of complexity and manpower required to pull off such an operation would have meant that we would have had far too many people snitching about what happened for the conspirators to ever get away with it. People also seem skeptical that the government would ever consider something so horrific. However, while it seems like something out of a dark fantasy, the truth is that the United States government has, at the highest levels, planned similar operations in the past. During the Kennedy years, the United States' greatest threat was the Cubans, led by Fidel Castro, and some in the government were looking for an excuse to start an actual ground war with the Cuban nation. Something that they wanted to get public support for both at home and around the world. It was to achieve this goal that the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time came up with a plan and proposed it to JFK. This was to attack United States citizens and property while pretending to be Cubans as part of a false flag operation to gain support for a war. Kennedy, well, he was very angry and he told them it was a terrible, immoral idea and they were to shelve it and never bring it up again. However, while Kennedy did not want to play ball, that doesn't mean there weren't ever any other presidents who didn't consider a similar plot. Number 9. President Woodrow Wilson's wife ran the presidency for over a year. During Woodrow Wilson's presidency, he was considered a very hard-working executive, whether you liked the man and his politics or not. He was regularly traveling the world in his attempts to get the United States involved in worldwide political alliances and also engaged in speaking tours across the country. Unfortunately, his habits of hard work eventually caught up with him, and nearing the end of his presidency, he suffered from a stroke. Many people at the time wondered if something was wrong and if there might be a conspiracy to keep the extent of the president's troubles from the public. In fact, the government tried so hard to cover it up that his stroke and general ill health was not known about for months. Even after that, the true damage was never really spoken about to the press and not known until years later. Many people suspected that his health was indeed worse than the government was letting on, and that his wife was actually making most of the decisions, basically being the first woman president. While Edith claimed that she was nothing but a steward, historians who studied the time period in later years are certain that she practically was the chief executive of the country for well over a year. For those who still doubt her influence, keep in mind that while Edith Wilson was running the show, women finally gained the right to vote. Number 6. HAARP is not a weather control device, but massive weather control has been attempted. Many people like to go on about HAARP, a government science project that many people were convinced had a lot more going on than actually met the eye. The government claimed it was simply testing radio waves and their effects on the ionosphere and other mundane things that aren't really that interesting. Of course, conspiracy theorists were certain that something boring couldn't actually be boring and it had to be hiding something actually interesting. Of course, all evidence points to the government telling us the truth in this case, and HAARP is nothing more than a rather mundane research project that was shut down when the research had run its course. However, that doesn't mean weather control attempts have never been made or that the governments of the world aren't trying to understand the science behind it better. We know that during the Vietnam War, the United States government tried to seed the clouds around South Vietnam with various substances in the hopes that it would increase rainfall and make the war effort harder for their enemies. It certainly doesn't stretch the imagination that technology of that sort has improved over time. Number 7. The United States government has experimentally poisoned US cities multiple times. Many people will claim that the government is secretly poisoning you in one way or another, whether through chemtrails, fluoride, or some other insidious means. Now, evidence has shown that most of these theories are total hogwash. However, that doesn't mean the United States government has never poisoned its own people. According to government records that were released years after the fact, during the 1950s through the 1970s, the United States government conducted nearly 300 bacterial weapon attacks on various US cities in order to understand the results. One of the most famous of these was in San Francisco, where the government wanted to see if the fog would help spread a biological attack and if an enemy could stage such an attack from the sea. They used hoses to release the bacteria, and according to their own data, it reached essentially everyone in the city and effectively spread out as if it was a harmful bacteria. They used hoses to release the bacteria, and according to their own data, it reached essentially everyone in the city and effectively spread out enough that if it were a harmful bacteria, the damage would be horrific. While the United States used bacteria that they thought were mostly harmless, multiple people were proven to be hospitalized because of the attack, and at least one person died because of it. The United States' secret experiments were deeply against the Nuremberg codes that they had recently agreed to, which makes the entire thing all the more irresponsible and immoral. Number 6. There is some small truth to the beliefs people have in the government spraying chemtrails. One of the most oft-recurring conspiracy theories is the claim that the government, or governments, are spraying chemicals in the upper atmosphere in order to do all kinds of terrible things. Some people claim that the chemtrails are to slowly make people stupider, while other people claim that the Earth has an overpopulation problem and world governments are releasing anti-fertility drugs into the upper atmosphere. Of course, there is no evidence for any of this, and scientists and other engineers in the know will tell you that the trails you see from planes are not out of the ordinary. Even if planes were secretly releasing chemicals, it would be impossible to sample properly in order to prove it. However, while there is no concerted effort to poison the atmosphere and no known plan to ruin people's fertility or anything of that sort, the fact is that governments of the world have strongly considered and researched geoengineering solutions to our current climate change problem. And the reality is that if those governments thought they had a workable solution, they almost certainly would attempt it. Even back in the days of Lyndon Johnson, scientists had been proposing dealing with climate problems with massive geoengineering, either with satellites in orbit, particles laced in our upper atmosphere, which sounds similar to the chemtrail theories, or any number of other crazy solutions. Of course, while we know governments have attempted at least somewhat massive geoengineering in terms of making it rain, there is no hard evidence that massive attempts to push back environmental damage are at anything more than the research stage as of now. Number 5. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was not one crazy actor acting alone. Now, folks at the time of Lincoln's assassination may or may not have immediately known or guessed that many different people were involved. However, most people today tend not to be aware of the scale of the plot. Many people today believe that the assassination of a president like JFK could not have been pulled off by one lone wolf, but don't give much thought to the common belief held by most people that John Wilkes Booth acted alone when killing President Lincoln. The truth is, though, that assassinating a president is very hard work, and Booth had a lot of help. There were several co-conspirators involved, and they all had a role to play. If they had succeeded, they could have sowed horrific chaos in the highest levels of the United States government. The thing was, it was a much larger conspiracy than most people know and included most of his important cabinet members. One man was supposed to kill Vice President Johnson but lost his nerve, and another man attempted to kill the Secretary of War, William Seward, but failed in his attempt. Booth also would likely not have managed to escape if he hadn't had help. Number 4. During Vietnam, the US government fabricated an attack to gain support for war. Many people consider the idea of a government lying in order to get a country into war as unthinkable, and some people are still convinced that the Bush administration was only mistaken when it came to Iraq, WMDs, and the country's involvement in 9/11. People simply don't like to believe that their government would lie to them so that they could start a violent conflict in another part of the world or amp up one that was already going. However, back during the days of the Vietnam War, this is exactly what happened. There was an incident with a US ship called the Maddox, which supposedly reported a torpedo attack from the Vietnamese, which led to further involvement by the US in Vietnam. The truth, however, is that the entire thing was a total fabrication, designed from beginning to end in order to get the US further into the war. The Johnson administration actually sent the Maddox to perform covert attacks for the express purpose of egging the enemy on to attack them so that they could get more support for the war. On top of that, the torpedo was a false signal, and the Maddox quickly told the higher-ups that it was a false alarm, but the top brass still used it as an excuse for more war funding. Number 3. The US government deliberately poisoned alcohol during Prohibition to discourage use. Prohibition was one of the strangest eras in the history of the United States. People who were convinced drinking was the worst thing ever pushed super hard to ruin everyone else's fun, and they succeeded for a time, but not before doing untold damage because they couldn't mind their own business. The ban on one of the most popular things to ever exist in the history of the world backfired really spectacularly. It gave rise to all new organized crime groups, some of which took decades to dismantle. Indeed, for a long time after Prohibition, the black market on drugs was incredibly organized. Of course, the government wasn't happy with people flouting the drinking law whenever possible, but they also weren't happy about empowering criminal enterprises. So, the United States government went to great lengths to poison a bunch of alcohol that they knew would be making its way onto the black market in order to make people less likely to drink it. The program adulterated the alcohol, making it unfit to drink and causing people to get sick, and some people to even go blind. It would be many years before the government admitted to their role in sickening people who dared to drink some booze while it was illegal. While it sounds like something out of a bad movie, this was a reality during Prohibition, and it sent a lot of people to the hospital and even caused many deaths. Number 2. Joseph McCarthy's methods were wrong, but he was more right than people realize. Joseph McCarthy is considered to be one of the most wrong people who was ever wrong in politics, according to most of America. He is infamous for constantly and consistently decrying an incredible amount of people as Russian spies and angrily grilling them in front of the Senate. His paranoia about Russian agents was legendary, and his scorched earth tactics earned him the ire of the nation and the Senate, who eventually decided to censor him in 1954. However, while McCarthy's methods were almost certainly over the top and put a lot of innocent people unnecessarily through the ringer, the truth was that his paranoia may have been more justified than many people realize. Historical proof shows that the administrations of Truman and FDR were full of Russian spies, that the Communist Party in America was funded by Moscow, and there were indeed several high-profile Russian agents that were caught around that time period, including Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. McCarthy may have gone about things almost entirely wrong, but his fears were not entirely without justification. Number 1. The MLB may have changed the baseballs for the 2017 World Series. Baseball has always had a problem when it comes to exciting crowds, and also tends to have a bit of a trust problem with its fans. For baseball nuts, it's really exciting to see a picture-perfect game, for example, but the sport is boring for a general audience. This means that if the MLB wants people to tune into games, they need to make sure that more home runs happen, because it excites people's passions and keeps their butts in the seats. When the steroid scandal first broke, it turns out that the rabbit hole went far deeper than anyone thought, and it turned out that the MLB knew more than they were letting on and were trying to cover things up because viewership was up. More recently, things have become rather suspicious once again. The steroid era was starting to end and pitchers were getting control again. This meant not as much excitement, so something had to be done. The 2017 World Series set a record for having the most home runs in any World Series ever played, and players from both teams are 100% convinced that the balls used were significantly different. Both teams claimed that the balls were noticeably slicker, and this meant pitchers found it harder to achieve proper control, which means more home runs. While the MLB officially denied it, they officially denied knowledge of the steroid issue as well, and with both teams agreeing there was a major difference, it's hard to believe the MLB's denials in this situation. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and do not forget to subscribe for brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also got a new channel, Biographics. You can find a link to it in the description below. We do, if you couldn't guess from the name, biographies of people from throughout history. It's a longer format show, about 20 minutes per episode. I'd love it if you checked it out. Also, some of our videos from the archives over there on the right. And as always, thank you for watching.